If you want to open your Bibles to the book of Judges, we're going to be back into Judges this evening. As we started this morning out talking about some of the lessons that we learned from a people who have forgotten God, we're going to continue this evening looking at lessons that we learned from this book of exciting stories. There's no downplaying the things that we read there are things of fantastic accounts and amazing records, but they also are drawing our attention to see the great weight and the ugliness and the danger of sin. And so, if you're in Judges chapter 3, I'm going to read through the entire chapter with you this evening. We're going to do a very quick look at everything that is going on in that chapter. And then I hope to, as we step back from it, and we witness these characters, and we witness these events, Othniel and Ehud and Shamgar, as we think about the things that go on in this chapter, that we also recognize three different characteristics of sin, specifically the deceit of sin and how it presents itself versus what it really is, the way that it is something that encroaches into our lives, it kind of permeates through us, and how defeat and victory are seen in relationship to it. So I hope you'll keep those things in your mind. We'll start reading in chapter 3, and we're actually going to start in verse 7. We'll start a little bit further down into the chapter. So verse 7, the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Asheroth. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. When he went out to war, the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so that he prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. Then the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek. And he went and defeated Israel, and they possessed the city of the palm trees. The sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gerah, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made himself a sword which had two edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And it came about, when he had finished presenting the tribute, that he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal, and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he said, keep silence, and all who attended him left him. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And he had said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. And he had stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the refuse came out. Then Ehud went into the vestibule and shut the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. When he had gone out, his servants came and looked, and behold, the doors of the roof chamber were locked. And they said, he is only relieving himself in the cool room. They waited until they became anxious, but behold, he did not open the doors of the roof chamber. Therefore they took the keys and opened them, and behold, their master had fallen to the floor dead. Now he had escaped while they were delaying, and he passed by the idols and escaped to Sirah. And it came about when he had arrived that he blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country. And he was in front of them, and he said to them, "Pursue them, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan opposite Moab, and they did not allow anyone to cross. They struck down at that time about 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. After him came Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. That is an exciting account. It's hard, even as we read through it, not to find yourself animated as Ehud reaches and pulls a dagger from his thigh and shoves it into somebody's belly. It's, what is going on here? This is not the sort of thing that you expect when you open the Bible up to read. This isn't the sort of things, the sort of literature, the sort of stuff that we expect to hear. Judges chapter 3 is a mightily fascinating chapter. But as I said, it's drawing our minds to sin. It's drawing our minds to understand what is going on. So much has been made of this chapter, especially this cycle of Ehud and Eglon. And you maybe notice some of the language therein. Eglon was a very fat man. The people that served him were robust men. And Ehud is described as someone who can hide a dagger on his person, come into their midst. They seem very dim-witted. They're not very keen to what's going on, and he's very sharp and tactical. And all of these things, while interesting, miss the point of what's being described in these verses. The point being, sin has something that needs to get our attention. Sin has great ramifications. The beginning of this, I said that there's three ways we're going to look at this. The first one is this charade of sin. The chapter begins, and we didn't read this, but we referenced it this morning, with Israel needing to be taught war. In the Old Testament, what we discover is war rarely has anything to do with large numbers, with the size of your cavalry, the heavy artillery in your possession. It has everything to do with your relationship with God. Everything to do with how God is going to give you the victory, or give your enemies into your hands, or God saying, "I will march before you into the battle." That's repeated throughout the war language in the Old Testament. But as we pointed out this morning, Israel has forgotten Yahweh. And they've forgotten their relationship with Him. And they're serving false gods that offered them something that they coveted. Whether that be something, a desire to be like the people around them, or to have something that they saw in the world around them that they wanted for themselves. It offered them something. And Israel found that at the very least, what they thought they could gain from these false idols was more valuable than a relationship with the Lord. And then keeping His commands and His statutes. And that's what sin does. In a nutshell, sin promises something. It sort of creates a masquerade in which it puts on this facade of something that is very pleasing, something that we desire. Micah read for us from 1 John 2, and specifically in verse 16, you recall that language that we've heard often before. The lust of the flesh, the lust of as I regurgitate that back correctly, the lust of the eyes and the pride of life. But think about those things that appeal to us is what John is describing there. Things that appeal to our fleshly lives, things that look pleasing in our eyes, things that make us think more about ourselves and less about others, or certainly about God. Sin appeals to your desires. And sin says, "I am worthy of your loyalty. I am worthy of you giving me your attention, giving me your commitment." And that's why I use words like masquerade or charade, because it's false. It's a pretense. In fact, if you look at verse 8, here's what sin offered them, or here's what sin actually gave them. Maybe worshiping these false idols said you can have fertility, you can have success, you can have things that are going on in the world around you that you want, but you're not receiving. Why? Because of sin. And here's what it gave them. Verse 8, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. So he sold them into the hands of this Mesopotamian king. Sin delivered them suffering. And I want you to think about how that plays out. They serve false gods, they serve idols, they serve sinful things, and then they wind up serving another king. That is exactly what God warned in Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, in verses 47 through 48, it says this, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you. In hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, and in the lack of all things, he will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. This is how sin deceives us. Think about this in light of sins that we deal with today, specifically if you're thinking about sexual sins, such as pornography. Think about how if you choose to serve the idol of sexual desire, this is what I physically want, this is what I want to experience, and as we say, I'm just going to dabble with that. From time to time, I'm just going to maybe look at this a little bit here, but it's not going to define me. And you convince yourself, kind of like we talked this morning, that I'm sharing my heart with God. I'm giving God 90% of what I think about, 95% of what I do, but I'm reserving a little bit for this desire of mine. And we are very easily reminded by the religious world around us and by the Word of God in ways that God understands that I'm not perfect. God understands that I am broken. And thus I come to Him and open myself up saying, I need healing. I need to be repaired. And so we fool ourselves by listening to the lie of sin that God gets it. He understands. But over time, pornography becomes a yoke, an iron yoke that attaches around us until it destroys us. Not just destroying us spiritually, but it destroys us physically as well. And when I say that, I'm not trying to put some sort of fear of what might happen to our bodies, but understand that our choices in the way that we spend our mind thinking about gratification for ourselves, it changes us. And it changes the way that we see others. And it changes the relationships that we can have in the future so that they are marred and destroyed and cannot have a healthy sense of intimacy. We can become so ensnared by our idols that we can even appear ugly to the people around us who recognize that our desire is not for God or even for their well-being, but for our own selfish desires. Recognize what is being said here in chapter 3. Judges 3 is saying sin puts on a charade. Sin masks itself as something that is pleasing, something that will just give you what you desire. And yet, in truth, in reality, it does much, much more to damage and to hurt us. It also becomes constitutional. And you might think that's a weird way to use that word, that sin becomes constitutional. That is a word that when we speak about it, we generally draw to mind the image of a document that our society, our country is built off of, even though we may actually think that's really more in just talk and not actually in action. We say that's what the Constitution says, or the Constitution gives us this right. But at its core, Constitution means that it is something that makes up at the innermost being, it makes up the identity of an individual or of an entity. In that sense, the U.S. Constitution is meant to be the record of what our identity is, the entity of the United States. Who are we? We are what the Constitution declares. This narrative that we read about Ehud, it reveals and raises many concerning questions about the identity of Israel. One, it reflects Israel's idolatrous decisions have filled them. They have grown in many ways. We begin by learning that Moab, this nation, has come and taken possession of the city of the palm trees. The city of the palm trees is interesting. We don't see it referred to that way very often. You have to do just a little bit of digging to recognize what it's talking about. But in Deuteronomy 34:3, we learn it's talking about Jericho. The very first city that Israel conquers. The city in which God says, Joshua says, this city is under a ban. It belongs to the Lord. In fact, if anybody ever tries to rebuild it, it's going to come at the cost of their firstborn. And when Achan takes things from this city, it causes great trouble for all of Israel. This is a place reserved for God. I want you to think about it that way. A place reserved for God. And now the king of Moab has taken control of it. He possesses that city. As the story continues, we learn in verse 19 of another city, Gilgal. And in Gilgal, there are idols set up in such a prominent way that the narrator of Judges kind of points out, like that's a marker. We all know where he's at. It's where the idols are in Gilgal. And what's significant about Gilgal? Again, it is a place that has great significance to Israel and to the Lord. Gilgal is the place where they crossed over the Jordan and came into the land to begin the conquest. And specifically, you might remember that there was something erected at Gilgal, but it wasn't an idol. It was an altar. It was a gathering of 12 stones. And in Joshua chapter 4, verses 19 through about 24, listen to what it says about this passage. When your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, "What are these stones?" Then you shall inform your children, saying, "Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed." Now key in on this. "That all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever." There was a time in Israel's history when they were filling the land with memorials to what Yahweh had done in their life. When they were drawing attention to, this is to remind us that God brought us over on dry ground, just like he brought our fathers across the Red Sea on dry ground. This city, this rubble, is a reminder every time we see it of God's victory that he has given us in the land. Places inherently tied to the memory of Yahweh being systematically replaced with objects of their own making, their own desire, or the desires of their enemies. This is the great effect of sin in our life. Sin is not just a momentary weakness. Oh, I made a bad decision right then. I didn't practice very good decision making in that moment. I got mad at the person who cut me off in traffic and said things in front of my children that I probably shouldn't have said. A teacher, we're getting ready, many of us are preparing for back to school and all of the stress that brings. And one of the teachers is treating my precious angel in a way that I don't think they deserve. So I sent them an email and I probably said things I shouldn't have said in that email. It was just a momentary point of weakness. But what we learn in Judges chapter 3 is sin is not a momentary point of weakness. We begin to serve that which is enslaving us. We start using our mouths to attack others. We start using our hands for the work of our desire instead of the work of Yahweh, our God. Even people we once promised to honor and to cherish above all else become to be attacked and tore down by a change in our Constitution, who we are at our core. Jericho and Gilgal should remind us that we, with our words and with our thoughts and with our actions, are to be monuments to the great work of the Lord. What once was devoted to letting all people know that the hand of the Lord is mighty forever, now is dedicated to letting people know that I am mighty if you cross me. We must be very careful to recognize sin changes our Constitution. We also would do well to reflect on how sin, being brought up in these ways, that sin is something that masquerades itself as just giving us what we always wanted. It's going to just help us feel the way that we want to feel. It's going to give us happiness and joy. Sin is something that once we give into it, starts to slowly change us from the inside until it changes our identity. The way that we think and the way that we act are going to be depicted by this disloyalty to our God who has given His Son to change us. What do we do about that? How can we ever hope to overcome that? And that's what chapter 3 really shines. It shines light on how sin is conquered. And think about the ways that it does that. Number one, we start with Othniel. Othniel is he is from pedigree, even though it's not possibly truly Judean pedigree. Whether or not he's his brother, he's the younger brother of Caleb. There is this idea that Caleb is not actually an Israelite, but he has been absorbed into the Israelites and now serves God loyally. And this is a hero. This is a Judean hero. This is the sort of people that we write stories about. And we tell our kids about. Caleb going up on the mountain. Caleb taking the land. Caleb, who's 80 years old, still bringing it. This is Othniel. And none of that is brought up other than say, I need to make sure you know who I'm talking about. Othniel, the younger brother of Caleb. What is brought up that qualifies him to be this great deliverer? Verses 9 and 10. Yahweh raised him up, and the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. This is what empowers Othniel to be a deliverer for the children of Israel. This is how we're going to get out of the problem that sin has brought into our lives, by Yahweh raising up a deliverer and His Spirit being with him. When we read down a little bit further, we get to Ehud. Ehud is a magnificently fantastic person, a Benjaminite. Think about the things that is said about him. Benjamin is a noble name. He comes from, it's this idea of the son of my right hand. The right hand was the hand of power. That is a name that kind of gives you some confidence. Oh, he's a Benjamite. That should be somebody that is going to be able to do something. And the narrator kind of ironically says, hey, Ehud, son of my right hand who is not right-handed. He's left-handed. Right away, you kind of feel the contrast that's brought up, but also the way that the Hebrew words that. It's not really for certain, but seems likely that he's saying that his right hand was bound. He was bound in his right hand, and thus he's left-handed. The way that the Hebrew language there kind of describes that, it sounds like maybe he was more than just born left-handed, but he would have been lame, or that he had been injured in some way as to not be able to use his right hand. We're going to learn that this is a trait later on in Judges. We'll learn this is a trait that many of the Benjamites have, that they are fantastic left-handed warriors. But it's brought up kind of in an odd way, only in this account, to draw attention to maybe the fact that he's not everything that we think he should be. He's an unexpected deliverer. Son of the right hand with a crushed right hand. So he is also going to be one that is raised up by the Lord. And I want you to think about his name too. Ehud. That is a compound name that comes from two phrases, which is splendor and where. Where is the splendor? In fact, oftentimes as you see it discussed by scholars, they will add in there that it's a question that is asked almost as if it's asking someone of royalty. Where is the splendor majesty? Where is the splendor king? This is the depiction of all of Israel at this point. And we'll see it come up even more clearly when we get into the story of Gideon, when he says, where is Yahweh? Where is God? We've heard stories before. It seems like he's abandoned us. That's where we are as a people. Where is help? Where is the promises of the promised land? Where is the land flowing with milk and honey? Where is the splendor from a man who is likely maimed, and yet God is going to raise up this figure to do incredible things? Ehud does something interesting. In verse 28, Ehud is described as giving this instruction that's not all that unheard of. As he starts to, we see a little bit of forward momentum in this battle. We see that the king has been killed and things are moving like, hey, God is going to be with us. Ehud tells everybody else in Ephraim, he blows the horn, he says, go and pursue the Moabites. Go and kill these enemies, these invaders. But he says something specific. He says, the Lord has given them into your hand. And what makes that specific is in future times we're going to read a lot of the judges refer to God. And they're going to say just that. In fact, you'll find it in your translations. God has something to tell you, Ehud tells Eglon. Gideon is going to speak about what God has told him. But very few times will you hear them say, the Lord, and use the covenant name of Yahweh. But instead, the very indescript name El. El, by the way, was also a Canaanite god. And it portrays a period of time in the Judges where we're left wondering, who are they talking about? Who do they think is giving them the victory? Ehud, early on in these judge cycles, does not allow us to think that. He says Yahweh has given them into our hands. Yahweh is who lifted him up, and Yahweh is who he points to. Finally, you have Shamgar. And Shamgar is very interesting because what we read about him is what we know about him. There is very little in the Bible talking about Shamgar. And one of the things that it does mention, however, in that passage is that he is the son of Anath. Now, Shamgar and Anath are not Hebrew names. And it's unlikely that Shamgar was an Israelite, a Hebrew. Now, it's possible that his family have become proselytized into the Israelite people. It's also possible that if they were Israelites, they named their children very Canaanite names. But Anath is not likely his actual physical father, but the deity that he was devoted to. Anath is similar to Ashtaroth. Anath was a goddess of the Canaanite people who also served as a consort or spouse of Baal. You have someone whose literal, everything about them, everything about their identity says, I am an enemy of Yahweh. And God raises him up and uses him to deliver Israel. Again, an unlikely deliverer for the people of God. What I hope we see as we reflect on those things is if we're making a list of characteristics of what is needed to defeat and overcome sin, the type of characteristic, the type of person that fills all of those things is not likely the type of people that we run into in Judges chapter 3. But the people in Judges chapter 3 are exactly who God uses to deliver Israel and to do great things. It's because the chapter is highlighting an answer to defeating sin for all time. Not just in the days of the conquest, not just in the days of the united or divided kingdom, not just in the days of the New Testament church, but in all times. How do we defeat sin? And number one, we must recognize that we do it by not relying upon our own ability. It's not about you and me. It's about the mercy of God. That is easily seen in these accounts, that it is God that defeats Israel's enemies. But maybe less noticeable. And I say less noticeable, but we draw attention to it. Sometimes we draw too much attention to it. This phrase, and they cried out to the Lord. As I've pointed out a couple times already, and I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, there's not much in this description to say they repented. In fact, there's nothing in this description to say they repented. They were miserable because of the consequences of their sin, and they cried out and said, "This is our problem. This is what's happening. We are uncomfortable. We are oppressed. We are afflicted." And yet here's the mighty thing that we take from that. In ways of a step towards God, that's barely even a stride. But God's reaction to that is astonishing. Small steps towards the Lord are met with astounding leaps towards us. And if that doesn't draw pictures in your minds of the prodigal son, who has basically said, "Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me my stuff. I'm going to do what I want to do." And when everything is gone and he's coming back, and he's not coming back with, "Here's all the ways that I love you, and oh, you are a lot more important than I made you out to be, and you deserve so much more than I gave you, and I'm sorry." He's coming back with, just make me a servant. Just make me a servant. And as he comes down the road, working over that speech again and again, "I'm not worthy, just make me a servant," what he is met with that small stride back to the Father, is a Father who is running, racing to him, bringing with him everything that he feels he deserves, to clothe him with the garments of the family, to put a ring on his finger to illustrate to the world, "This is my son," bringing the feast to celebrate his return. Small steps towards God are met with astounding leaps towards us. God's grace and God's mercy is on full display in the book of Judges, and we have to witness that. We also have to witness the great decline in the spiritual, moral life of Israel. We have to see how wicked even some of their deliverers were showing themselves to be. But in doing so, see even brighter the light of God's mercy. And it brings us to our life today. I want you to think about, if you're here today and you're recognizing the sin that is in your life, sin which started out as a charade. It started out as, "This is what I promise to give you. Oh, if you speak to people this way, they're going to fear you and you're going to have power. If you think about people this way, you're going to be able to manipulate them and use them to your advantage." Sin that promises you to have whatever it is that you're wanting, but then you find yourself locked into its grasp. And it's not everything that it said it would be. It's killing you spiritually. It's destroying your relationship with God. It's destroying the relationship that you have with your parents and with your friends and with the people that love you. And it's slowly becoming everything that you are. Think about Judas. You ever reflect on how Judas is described not as committing theft, but as a thief? He was a thief. It was his constitution. It was what he had become. Maybe sin had said, "Hey, it's just a really small swipe out of the money bag, and then you've got what you want. You can go buy the things that you can want. You can do the things that you want." But what it gave him was the identity of a thief. As we reflect upon all that, reflect upon that closing realization. And in all of this, God only sees you and where you are and where He wants you to be. And with just a small step towards the Lord, we can expect a Father who is racing to us, to embrace us, to welcome us into His family. If you are here today recognizing that is where your sin has left you and understanding that God is offering to deliver you from that and bring you to Him, what I also want you to know is you're in a room filled with sinners who have also come to learn the same thing and have felt again and again the weight of sin in their life, the pain that it has caused, and the relief of deliverance when God brings us to mercy. If we can assist you this evening in experiencing that same joy and that same relief, please come forward and let's talk about it together as we stand and as we sing.